partnership with Nutrien. In partnership with Nutrien, we are presenting to you today this webinar on achieving water stewardship outcomes in the agricultural sector. We've got 4 great panelists that are going to join us today from 4 different organizations, bringing a bit of a mix in terms of perspectives, knowledge base, experience to agriculture and to water stewardship outcomes within that sector. Before we introduce each of these panelists in turn, I very briefly want to paint a very high-level picture about what's happening with agriculture and water stewardship, specifically in the US, but certainly globally. I think globally, most of us know the statistics in terms of how much water agriculture uses every day. Nearly 70% of water use withdrawals globally occur within that sector. A little bit different in the United States. Agriculture is the number 2 user of water in the US behind thermoelectric power. Nevertheless, it's a significant portion of water use in the US. And again, the situation is somewhat similar in Canada and certainly in Mexico as we look at the North American picture. We also know we're facing some severe impacts with greater frequency in terms of climate change. And most of us are going to feel climate change through impacts to our water resources, and agriculture is no different. So whether we're talking about the long-term drought in the Western United States, just today we've got another hurricane, another tropical storm in the Gulf states in the US. We've had some significant rain events in the southeastern portion of the United States, the mid-Atlantic. There's drought in the prairie provinces in Canada, and we know about the perpetual state of stress to water resources in Mexico. The case for action on water stewardship in agriculture has already been made. It is time now for us to act. Some of you may know us here at the Water Council from our work over the past 6 years with the Alliance for Water Stewardship, and they have a standard that farms can use in terms of implementing a water stewardship plan or even getting certified to that standard. Our tech is going to put into the chat a link for you to follow in terms of some work that we did with a dairy in Wisconsin called Nutrien Farms. To date, it is the only farm certified to the AWS standard in North America. And there are a couple of reasons for why the AWS standard hasn't necessarily been widely adopted yet in agriculture. I suspect part of that is really because of the unique nature of the challenges facing agriculture, whether that is commodity prices, whether it's the fact that it really needs a community stakeholder approach to doing water stewardship on farms. There are multiple reasons. So again, it's good today to hear from these different organizations that it's not just one standard or one approach. We're going to need multiple approaches. We're going to need multiple stakeholders, and we really need to act now in terms of achieving water stewardship outcomes in agriculture. So with that being said, I'm going to introduce now to you our panelists in order. First up, we're going to hear from Carrie Sanders. She's the Director of Agricultural Engagement at the Nature Conservancy. She's going to give us a bit of a broad view of agriculture and water quality today and share kind of what the story is right now in the United States around quality and some of the things that TNC is doing in that regard. Following Carrie is going to be Peyton Harper. He's the Director for Retail and Field Sustainability at the Fertilizer Industry. Peyton's going to cover 4R nutrient stewardship. He's going to talk a little bit about some of the research as well that's new out there around imbalance and some other things. So thanks for being here, Peyton. Following him is going to be Mike Nemeth. Mike is the Senior Advisor for Agriculture and Environmental Sustainability at Nutrien. Mike is going to kind of bring a watershed perspective in terms of the work that Nutrien has been doing throughout its value chain, talk about some of the farm tools and other approaches that they use at Nutrien to address water stewardship with their partners and again in their value chain. And then last but not least, it's our honor to have on maybe his last professional webinar as a General Mills employee. It's Jeff Hanratty. He's the Sustainability Manager at General Mills. I've gotten to know Jeff over the past 6 or 7 years or so on our work together on water stewardship. Jeff is going to start with a real simple question. How does a food company look at water risk? Unfortunately, that question is simple. The answers are not. And Jeff is going to tell us a little bit about the work that General Mills has been doing, both within its direct operations, but primarily looking at, again, a watershed perspective and addressing water risk and water use in their supply chain. So these are our 4 speakers. Each of them are going to have about 10 minutes to give you their perspectives, their background. We're going to hold questions until the end. So just hold on to your questions. If you got a burning question, type it into the chat and we'll get to it right away when we get to the Q&A portion. But we're going to jump right in now with Carrie. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Carrie.
Thanks, Matt. And good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to talk with you today. As we dig into the agriculture and water, you'll notice if you're familiar with the Alliance for Water Stewardship, there's a lot of overlaps with the goals that you have, whether it's sustainable water balance, the good water quality that you're working towards, even working in where water has sensitive areas and ensuring safe water. And as many of you know, TNC has been a founding member of AWS, and even on the call today, we have Nabia Fusiyama, who is our representative. So happy to be here. And I work on our North American ag team. I grew up on a hog and crop farm in Northwest Ohio, and actually this picture is one of our farm fields where we double cropped with sunflowers as a cover crop. I get to test out a lot of what we talk about at work. And I've worked at the Nature Conservancy for about 11 years, where I get to work at the intersection of agriculture and conservation, where the Nature Conservancy helps to conserve the lands and water in which all life depends. Next slide, please. Thank you. Yep. So I thought that I would start with a little bit of information about the Gulf of Mexico and the nitrogen loading there. You'll see the darker red on the map on the left, and that means that more nitrogen is leaving those dark red areas than the green, which is further away. Also, I wanted to share some of the sources of that nitrogen. So when you look at the graph on the right, about 70% of the nitrogen that's getting into the Gulf of Mexico comes from various ag production systems, whether it's corn and soybeans, other crops, or the pasture and rangeland. So that means that agriculture has a huge opportunity to lessen the amount of nitrogen that gets into the Gulf of Mexico. I'm sure many of you have seen this before, and when you think about ag systems, there's a lot of different practices that we can do to help with that. And if you go to the next slide, there's 12 states along the Mississippi that have nutrient reduction strategies. Now there's 31 states overall that just impact this. And this is, I'm sharing this as an example of some things that we can do in water quality. So the graph that's pulled over here on the right side, it's from Iowa, and it is there. It shows Iowa's current science on how various practices can help impact what gets into the Gulf. So everything from land use to nutrient management. And you'll see that the brown portions on the bottom, those are connected to something the industry has branded the 4 R's. It's the right rate of fertilizer at the right time, at the right place, using the right source. And you might notice that the nutrient management practices have a much smaller impact than if you look at the land use or the edge of field practices. And to keep a thriving agriculture, we need to look across all 4 of these types of practices listed, specifically with the increased rain intensity that we're seeing with these shifting climate conditions. The ag community has also worked on a voluntary certification similar to, but different, from AWS, and that's the 4R certification program, where an independent third-party auditor verifies that the nutrient service provider or the sales folks at the agronomy location, or companies like Nutrien, are not only training their staff with the best science, but those staff, those nutrient service providers, are giving and following the best science when it comes to nutrient recommendations for the farmer and for the environment. And we have about 4 million acres across North America that are impacted by and using a 4R certified provider. So it's really exciting to see the changes and the scale that we can have. If you go to the next slide, now we just saw that, you know, land management and land use changes can make a huge difference, but it does depend on where you put those in the watershed. And we have the science, the technology to pinpoint where those practices could be the most impactful, narrowing the possibilities down to, in the case of wetlands, to just 1 to 2% of the watershed put into wetlands could make a huge difference to that 40% reduction that the Gulf of Mexico needs. So the Nature Conservancy just completed a Edge of Field roadmap. The URL is right there, which highlights some of the technology and the fact that policy will need to support this targeted action to help make it happen. Not all practices are going to be put in place because they're profitable to the landowner or the land manager, the farmer. Some practices are simply for the greater good, for society's benefit. If you go to the next slide. So as many of you know, the Nature Conservancy is a science-based, practical, and collaborative organization. And we developed this website with some of our partners to better share the science behind different practices and outcomes. Like, if you go to agevidence.org, you'll find this snazzy little chart. And what I love about it is when you think about the principles that we have for sustainable or regenerative food production, we think about keeping living roots in the soil for as long as possible during the year, diversifying crops, following the 4 R's of nutrient stewardship, and tilling or plowing the soil as minimally as possible. And there's a lot of research out there that kind of hits on all of those things. So what this chart does is the scientists have taken all the data and they've put it in a manner that is much easier for folks like myself to understand and pull data out. So just as an example, if you're interested in how tillage impacts water quality, you can click on that little box there where you'll find summarized 510 observations from 21 studies that touch down in the Midwest. And when you think about how tillage is connected to water quality, it's, you know, leaving the topsoil vulnerable to erosion from wind or water. Both can cause big issues. But when the soil moves, so do the nutrients like phosphorus that are attached. And when we're losing up to, you know, 3 inches of topsoil in a year, over time, that's a huge number. And it can both degrade not only the capabilities of our agricultural production, but also our streams. So please take a look at the Ag Evidence site. And if there's studies that we don't have, please send them along. Next slide, please. So the agriculture and conservation communities are adding new technologies every year to helping farmers to, as Hugh Hammond Bennett said, treat each acre according to its need. Transformation of our food supply chain is going to take a lot of collaborative effort, where we have to be new to open opportunities, addressing those science gaps that we all know are there, and being comfortable being uncomfortable as we test out some new alternative solutions. You know, we've worked on maps and models and targeted conservation practices to make as big of an impact as possible. And we need to also help farmers make those changes. So it's great to have the folks on the phone today to share some of the work that they're doing to help farmers make those changes. There's also efforts like the Ecosystem Service Market Consortium, where they're helping create a system where farmers, landowners are rewarded for their environmental outcomes. And one of the things that I really appreciate about the ag and science and conservation communities is when we think about making changes, we also talk about outcomes. And we need to show those outcomes, talk about those, specifically in the face of climate change. And as I turn it over to my colleagues, I just want to say thanks for your collaboration and innovative work, and for all your support on quantifying the benefits to the environment. So with that.
Great. Thanks, Carrie. And that's the right note to end on. We do need to quantify these benefits. We do need to demonstrate change and that we are achieving those outcomes. Next up after Carrie is Peyton at the Fertilizer Institute. Peyton, I'll turn it over to you. We have slides here. Should be good to go.
Great. Hello, everyone. Again, I'm Peyton Harper. I'm the Director of Retail and Field Sustainability Programs at the Fertilizer Institute. And it's really my pleasure to be here to speak to an audience that not necessarily is thought about as a primary audience when you think about the fertilizer industry and who we typically interact with, who we're addressing on a daily basis. And so with that, I want to give a little bit of background on the Fertilizer Institute, or TFI as I'll refer to it along the way, and really why we're here in this space, how we play a role, and really why I have a huge belief that we belong here as a part of not just a contributor, but also a huge piece of the solution. Next slide, please. So for us, the Fertilizer Institute, we are the industry's trade association in the United States. We're the voice of the fertilizer industry, and we represent everything from public policy, communications, stewardship and sustainability work, which will correlate directly to our 4R effort that we're going to talk more in depth about here in a moment, all the way through to market intelligence needs of every type of fertilizer producer, wholesaler, retailer, and all other business facets within the industry supply chain. And when we talk about the fertilizer industry, earlier Matt started out talking about how agriculture is the second largest user of water in the US today. Well, agriculture is a huge user of water, and fertilizer is a huge component of agriculture. There's a direct correlation between the two, and how we're able to find as an entire framework that builds upon each other, it gets complex very, very quickly. So today, we're going to dive in a little bit into some of those basic, intermediate, and advanced levels before our practice implementation and how that relates to on-farm metrics. Next slide, please. So I mentioned basic, intermediate, and advanced practices of 4R, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, but I just want to point out that anyone who is farming, like I said, anyone who's ever had a backyard garden who's made a fertilizer decision, you have made some type of basic 4R decision, whether that was choosing the type of nutrient that you were going to apply, choosing if you were going to apply it on a rainy or sunshiny day, if you were going to top apply it, or if you were simply going to incorporate it into the soil. These are very basic decisions of 4R, very basic decisions of nutrient management. As we continue, there's more advanced practices that lead into intermediate and then all the way to advanced. So think of advanced as being your top tier producer in the US today, someone who is living and breathing their bottom line. And when we started to think of 4R from not just an environmental perspective, but how do we enact that change in the agricultural and fertilizer industries to really bring on the producer? What speaks to them in a light that, of course they want to be stewards of the environment, and they are. Every day they make their living off of the land. Anyone that ever tells you that a farmer doesn't care about the environment is just plain wrong, folks. Farmers are the most adamant advocates for the environment out there because they depend upon it more so almost than any of the rest of us, and we depend on the farmer. And so to that light, we knew that the direct route to the farmer, and have found out more so through studies, is that it's direct through their bottom line, through the economics of showcasing how nutrient management practices correlate to the decision-making process on the farm. So the graph on the right here, when we're looking at this, and this is through 2014 to 2017 on a corn producer in Illinois, someone who was able to move from basic practices in 2014 to an intermediate through advanced all the way in 17, and has continued to remain in advanced practices since this. We're able to really show that the cost of implementing better nutrient management practices, and we'll talk about some of the benefits of what these management practices showcase in a moment, but as he continues to adopt better management practices, his cost of implementation goes down. So his return on his fertilizer investment is continuing to go up and up with each passing year. Next slide, please. One way for us to really take a look at this is comparing not just yield, but also, and we're going to focus directly on nitrogen for this primary example, which I have to thank Carrie for showing one of that first slides there, showing the nutrient movement of, from the Midwest, from the Corn Belt down through the Mississippi into the Gulf. That was the darkest red center in the US. And quite frankly, Illinois being straight in the center of that is an excellent example. I wish we'd have planned that, but I can't take full credit there. Sometimes things just work out. As we look at kind of the corn grain yield here, so we'll look at that second line down after the practice level implementation of 4R. 2014, 229, 2015, still at basic 220. There's always going to be some weather adaptation within a cropping year, things that we can't control with fertilizer, but we can use fertilizer best management practices within the 4R framework to help mitigate some of those weather risks. But then you see a huge jump when we move from basic to intermediate in 2016, and another pretty significant jump in a what was kind of a mixed weather year, if folks can remember back to this cropping season, of going from an intermediate at 246 to advanced at 256 corn grain yield bushels an acre. Application rates of nitrogen, as you show, as we see application rates of nitrogen remain fairly steady for the most part. There's some things that we have a residual nitrogen that's left in the soil. So you see a lower application rate in 2015, higher application rate due to removal coming off in 2016, and then again, a lower in 17 is a trend that you'll see across really top tier producers in the Corn Belt. But one thing that I would like to focus on is the nitrogen use efficiency. So as you see each year, we've really trended being towards better nitrogen use efficiency in this operation, all the way down to 0.8 pounds of nitrogen per bushel applied. It's just a phenomenal number that we're looking at here. And when you compare that to imbalance, following on the next line, we're really looking at a negative. He is mining nitrogen at this point, folks. He is removing more nitrogen than's being applied and is being found in the soils. One thing I believe that we can all agree on is, we want to keep eating. We want to keep farmers producing in a very productive mindset. And as we can, as new seed technologies have come on board, as new farming practices evolve, we're really able to take advantage of larger applications of nutrients are needed to meet demand. And as we continue to mine nutrients out of the soil, it's of the utmost importance that they become replaced each and every year to meet the need that's going on. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Peyton, and 1 minute left.
Okay. And one of the things that I'll talk about extremely quickly is on nutrient use across the board. So nutrient use efficiency from a world level, we sit about 0.58 here. When you look at the EU, you become a little bit more, a little bit less efficient, 0.55. We jump to the US, our nutrient use efficiency levels really start to show an improvement here. And all of these do tend to correlate towards corn yield as well when you look at a world perspective. For our advocates, these are producers that are within a program within the Fertilizer Institute that are truly top tier producers in the US. And one thing I just want to say is you look at the averages from the US, from the world, from the EU, and comparative to what a true top tier producer is, you can see a huge difference in their nutrient use efficiency. There is some relation to yield there, but really that NUE number is what we should focus on. As people continue to produce better crops in a more efficient manner, we're able to have a direct correlation to how those nutrients are used and therefore how they'll end up impacting water quality down the line. So better use across the board. And I'll just jump to the next slide and say, for those of you who want a little bit more information, want to look at a little bit of a more direct impact per crop, I would direct you to 4rfarming.org to take a look at some of our case study data that we've put together over the past several years, working with some land-grant university folks to really showcase how nutrient use efficiency plays a role in individual crop production across the U.S. So with that, I'll just say thank you, and I look forward to any questions at the end of the day.
Excellent. Thanks, Peyton. Appreciate that. And the research and the trend lines in terms of the efficiency. We're going to move on to Mike from Nutrien, who is going to tell us a little bit about all the tools that they've got at Nutrien and some of the work that they're doing in their value chain on water stewardship. Mike, over to you.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks, Peyton and Carrie, for your presentations. Those really kind of flow into what I'm hoping to talk about today and provide some great context. And, Peyton mentioned and talked a lot about nutrient stewardship. And when I think about nutrient stewardship and water stewardship, a lot of the principles go hand in hand. And so it's really nice that these kind of dovetail together. So thank you for that context. So I'm excited to be able to talk to you guys today and share with you how Nutrien is thinking about water stewardship in terms of our business and the agri-food supply chain, both through farming practices, technology, and products for improved water outcomes. Next slide, please. So just a bit on who Nutrien is and what we do. Nutrien has over 25,000 employees and operates and has investments in 14 countries throughout the world. Nutrien is the largest provider of crop inputs, services, and solutions. So we play a critical role in feeding the future and helping growers increase food production in a sustainable manner. Water is an essential input into our global operations, especially in our mining and fertilizer production areas where we need water for raw mineral transportation and milling in our potash and phosphate mining operations, as well as steam generation and cooling at our nitrogen fertilizer production facilities. In Australia, we have our Nutrien water business, which directly assists growers in creating water strategies to help drive water use efficiency by providing technology, infrastructure, and expertise to sustainably access water and irrigate their crops. And indirectly, water is an essential part of all of our downstream retail business, as all of our growers, customers need water to produce crops. So next slide, please. So Nutrien's approach to water stewardship starts by taking a watershed perspective across all of our operations and using practices, products, and digital tools to support stewardship in agriculture at the farm level. So that water stewardship, or that watershed perspective, is a critical first step in water stewardship, as you really need to understand the many environmental and social aspects of a watershed in which you operate, whether you're producing fertilizer, growing crops, or processing and packaging food products. You have to look outside of your operational fence line in order to reduce water-related risks, understand your opportunities to collaboratively address shared water challenges. So with agricultural production, it's very highly dependent on water, and it can be a contributor to water quality concerns that have been mentioned. So working within the agri-food supply chain to improve agriculture's water use efficiency, to be able to sustain water resources and to help manage risks related to those broader social and economic water related impacts are essential to a sustainable and productive agri-food sector. So next slide. So as the world's largest supplier of agricultural inputs, services, and solution, Nutrien is a global leader in nutrient stewardship. We actively promote and work with the 4 Rs that have been explained, and we help lead in agricultural sustainability. And we really value supporting growers in stewarding agriculture's greatest inputs, which are nutrients and water. Both are critical for crop production. And Nutrien recognizes the importance of water and is a strong advocate like I said, for 4R that both Peyton and Carrie have mentioned. So to help protect the air, the soil, and the water during agricultural production, and to minimize resulting product impacts, our retail division, Nutrien Ag Solutions, provides its growers with our grower customers with digital tools and expertise to use that use technology, data, analytics, and experience. This allows our growers to be able to work directly with our staff to be able to make informed and sustainable decision making. Next slide, please. So I'd like to focus for a few minutes on best practices. Some of these best management practices that happen in the field and are really key to creating positive soil, water, carbon, and biodiversity outcomes. So these include things like land management. So when we think of land management, that could be identifying marginal growing areas that really aren't great for producing crops, and maybe identifying those using technology like Echelon, which is our precision ag platform, and looking at how do we diversify that landscape. So can we, increase productivity using products on land that's growing crops really well and diversify the marginal land into things like a perennial forage, or planting a pollinator mix for pollinator habitats, or maybe even converting it to a wetland. There's nutrient management, which has been talked about, and that's building a science-based nutrient management plan, which can include things like controlled release fertilizers, which help release nitrogen and at times when the crop needs it, and variable rate application, which goes into some of those advanced practices that Peyton mentioned, to be able to have that precision agriculture and put the product where it's needed and when it's needed. There's field management type practices, and those are often helping to build soil health, like no-till seeding that Carrie mentioned, and planting of cover crops, which she showed on her own farm. And those help reduce runoff from the field, and also help sequester carbon in the soil. So again, building that soil health. And even the use of specialty products. So there's specialty products that include micronutrients to be able to help plant growth and create more root mass, biostimulants or fertilizer catalysts that help increase productivity and increase that nutrient use efficiency. So through promotion of these technologies, practices, and products, agribusiness retailers like Nutrien are really a direct conduit to the farm management practices, as we work directly with the growers. So we're very interested in water stewardship and promoting the practices, the technology, and the products that help reduce nutrient loss from the field. So on-farm practices and solutions have multiple benefits, including increased soil health, water holding capacity, reduced runoff, carbon sequestration, and greenhouse gas emission reductions, which all at the end of the day help build resilience for the farm while creating sustainability and ESG value in the supply chain. Next slide, please. So to close, I would just like to mention an innovative project that's in the early startup phase in the Lake Winnipeg Basin in Manitoba, Canada, that brings together diverse actors for collective action in the agri-food supply chain. So you can see on the screen the logos of some of the initial partners, and there are plans to engage local watershed groups, government representatives, regional NGOs, and other actors in the watershed. This is a learning project, and it's a pilot to pilot agricultural water stewardship through land and nutrient management at the farm level, and to learn how to effectively engage the agri-food supply chain in water stewardship to create value and to deliver positive environmental and other outcomes. Nutrien is committed to working collaboratively to address shared water related challenges and opportunities through water stewardship action and partnerships by drawing upon relevant best practices found within the Alliance for Water Stewardship International Water Stewardship Standard, which will be applied in this project. So I'd like to invite those participating in the webinar today or watching the recording of this webinar to think about how you might want to engage with agribusiness retailers that are serving the farmers directly. to be able to help move the needle in the agri-food supply chain on positive water outcomes. And with that, I'd just like to say that Nutrien is really looking at that global thinking, again, using that watershed perspective to make plans regionally, but to support local action to make a difference across the agri-food supply chain in agricultural communities, as we have to think globally, plan regionally, and act locally. And it has to be done through partnerships and collaborations, because you can't do water stewardship by yourself. So next slide. That's it. So thank you. And I'll pass it back to Matt to head over to Jeff.
Thanks, Mike. Jeff, you're up next. Mike is right. Collaboration is key. I'm going to turn the reins to the Q&A over to Dylan from the Water Council. Apparently my audio is spotty. So fortunately for you all, this is the last you'll see of me today, and Dylan is going to jump on for Q&A. So Jeff at General Mills, bring it home for us today.
Good thing. Thank you, everybody. Next slide. I'm going to talk a little bit about why does General Mills care about water and how do we focus our work. And so similar to what Peyton said, our entire business model relies on the land and what farmers do. And so if farmers aren't stewards of the land, and then we're not a steward of the land. So ultimately we have to work, hand in hand with farmers, and we really don't contract or hire any farmers, with the exception of maybe in some of our organic business. So a little bit about General Mills. You can see some of our products down on the bottom there. We are in just about everybody's pantry. This is just some statistics from our annual report. There's another one that I would also point out is that about 99% of our water impact is outside of our own four walls. Next slide. So really, how do we focus this work? Oh, there you got it. There's your water footprint on that slide. So how do we focus? So we ultimately need to have an ambition. All of our, most big companies have some sort of ambition. So our ultimate goal is to champion the activation of water stewardship plans for the company's most material and at-risk watershed in our global value chain by 2025. And so that's a lot of words, and it's really out of our control. We don't write watershed plans, but we want to champion the activation of them. That means we need to get involved and make sure that these specific places, which are shown on the map, and I won't go into detail on this map, but those specific places have a plan in place and they're activating against it. And there's lots of different ways to activate against it, from using the Alliance for Water Stewardship standard on the farm or in a manufacturing place, or developing water funds, et cetera. But ultimately, there's 4 phases that we put each one of these watersheds in. It's an assessment, what is the problem? Phase 2 is what can we do and who's doing it? Phase 3, get involved with who's doing it. And phase 4, get it onto that activation of water stewardship plans. And so ultimately, that's where sustainability comes in, is defining what sustainable is for a watershed. And it's different wherever you look. So ultimately, we're very interested in what's going on in agriculture from climate and water perspective. So how do we get to this? Next slide. We did an assessment, and I would suggest any of you listening in from a company do something similar, is look at where you buy stuff and where you make stuff in your supply chain. And so we looked at 300 different facilities and sourcing regions, covered 60 major watershed bases, 221 minor water subbasins. It sounds like a lot, but there's really good tools that help you do this. And so you have to pick a place. And so, for example, for the key ingredients that we looked at on the right, we had to pick a place where those are grown and put them into these assessment tools, such as Aqueduct or WWF's water risk filters, and then really try to assess the risk, using the things that most affect your business: quantity, quality, reputation for General Mills. And so a key ingredient for us is something that we buy a lot of, or something that's geographically restricted. We can't buy it from somewhere else. So example, cinnamon or almonds, 80% or 85% of the world's almonds come out of California. We just can't buy them somewhere else. So it's a key ingredient for us. And other ingredients such as wheat, we just buy a lot of wheat. Next slide. So this is a really busy slide, but what this is the result of that assessment, and helps us prioritize. So we came up with, the top 50 and tried to narrow those down to what we should be working on, which is most material for our business. So there's some high water risk that we did not prioritize for business reasons. And we went back with our sourcing group. And so we prioritized 8 that we call tier 1 and 3 that we call tier 2. And so next slide, what that really means, oh, the triangle slide. So we kind of looked at this 2 ways. So acute risk is an issue that could take out our business, or our business could take out a watershed, if you will, through our sourcing activities. So that's acute. That's immediate business need, could shut us down with whether lack of ingredient or shutting down a plant, forest fire that in the Rio Grande watershed would take out our Albuquerque facility. So we're really focused on that acute type of risk. Acute tier 2, those are those watersheds that we already have got to phase 4. Remember, they have a plan and it's in activation. I'm not saying we're done with those, but they're in a lot better shape than tier 1. And so we kind of broke those down between tier 1 and tier 2. Remember, we have 8 in tier 1 and 3 in tier 2. That's that acute risk. And then the diffuse risk, those toxicology students in the room would, this is like your chronic risk. Your diffuse risk, this is where General Mills has a water impact, but it can't be specifically tied to our business. And that would be like what Carrie talked about, the Mississippi watershed. Like, you can't say that all of that can be tied directly to Wheaties or a General Mills product, but we're part of it. And we need to be part of the solution. And that's where a lot of this regenerative agriculture and 4Rs really comes in, that General Mills can encourage to happen in the supply chain. So we're not measuring this as detailed as we would in the acute types of risk to be able to declare, look what we, look where we are in terms of managing this risk, but it's just as important. And we're really, really focused in climate change. And as you know, in regenerative agriculture, there's a huge overlap between water and climate impacts that regenerative agriculture can have, as well as biodiversity and soil health. So next slide. So I already showed this, but this again is really how we map out the risk and really what we're doing about it. And so if you go to generalmills.com and look at our responsibility section, you'll find this map. It's an interactive map. You can click on any of these watersheds and see what the risk is and what we're doing about it, whether it's advancing AWS in some of our manufacturing plants, or like I said, advancing water trusts or water funds, or just getting involved in organizations like QAC in California, California Water Action Collaborative, or advancing regenerative agriculture in almonds in California. I mentioned almonds. And then another section of our website, you'll find what we're doing about regenerative agriculture. And I won't belabor that, but that is a huge solution to General Mills water impact. Maybe not so much on the business risk side of thing, but General Mills water impact is being addressed with regenerative agriculture. So I'll stop there to get us back on time, I hope, so we can get to some questions.
Thank you, Jeff. As Matt noted, I'm going to take over from here. My name is Dylan Waldhuter. I'm the Water Stewardship Program Manager at the Water Council. It's great to hear from such a diverse group of presenters that are kind of all uniting around this common thread that is water stewardship. So we have them with us for roughly 10 more minutes. We're going to turn it over now to the audience for question and answer. So if you have a question, we don't have any submitted just yet, but don't be shy. Please submit them in the chat, and I'll facilitate the question and answer. If there aren't any questions just yet, perhaps I'll ask that the panelists offer their perspective on other standards and or methodologies or approaches that aren't maybe 4R or AWS that might be beneficial to the challenges that we've been discussing today. So I'll open that up broadly. Yeah, please, Jeff.
I'll just say one thing that we, and I think all the other presenters would agree that if we expect farmers to provide ecosystem services to address water stewardship and climate change, we got to pay them for it. Society has to pay them. General Mills can't afford it, but maybe the money flows through General Mills. But society has to pay farmers for these ecosystem services because they are stewards of the land, but they can only do so much before it starts costing them significant dollars. Cover crops are not cheap. You know, they're 20 to 30 bucks an acre just for the seed. So if we're going to ask farmers to do these great things, we have to find a way to pay them. And that's where we see the ecosystem services and some of those types of carbon markets, et cetera, hopefully will catalyze that.
Agreed. And just to build on Jeff's point, I mean, I think taking that systems approach, whether you look at it from a watershed or any kind of system, is being able to look at it more than just carbon, being able to look at it as more than just water, because these practices, you know, this technology, it helps for many different environmental outcomes. And so, you know, be able to transition some of the marginal land out and maybe planting perennials or, you know, infield practices and certain products, they all contribute to positive water, climate, biodiversity, soil outcomes, which, yes, they do cost money. And at the end of the day, it probably is up to society to be able to help, you know, make sure that these ecosystem services can take place and that, you know, growers can be compensated for their efforts on the land. So.
It's a great point. I would even offer that it's a little bit further than just payment for practices and payment for society to understand that this has a cost to it. I think it's a bigger educational issue for society to understand as a whole what the agricultural industry actually does to produce the food and continue with the welfare, you know, and sustainable farming systems that they've become used to. You know, it's an old statistic that gets thrown out in ag circles quite often, but I mean, the majority of the population today is more than 3 generations removed from an on-farm, hands-on operation. And when you really think about that, you know, you have kids growing up now that even their great-grandparents weren't involved in a farming operation. They don't know what it's like to even simply pick up eggs in the afternoon, let alone what it's like to make fertilizer management practices that could impact soil quality and water quality down the line for generations to come. So I definitely think there's some education to be had here, but it's 100% a society decision to make that.
And there's been a lot already said. I think the only thing that I would add to the great comments already is that policy is a great way and taxes are a great way to help support some of these ecosystem services. So we're working on the markets now. If you're not familiar with ESMC, please go there and check that out. Paying for the ecosystem services is really important. The biodiversity that's offered when you add in wetlands or you add in trees back into the landscape, or keeping grassland is a big deal. And when you combine that market along with policy incentives or tax incentives to do those things, we really need to get serious about the ecosystem services. And we kind of, I think in some ways we skip around the conversation and think, oh, the market's going to fix all of this. We'll just have a market for it and that'll solve it. But in some ways, taxes have disincentives for it, and whether it's property tax or otherwise. And sometimes we need to, you know, put the money where our mouth is, right? If we want to support clean water and have biodiversity and have birds be able to migrate freely, we need to take care of those places where they live and the things that can filter the water. So it needs to be beyond just markets. We also need to think about some of those policy levers. And I think Michael talked about it being more than carbon. So carbon is the big conversation right now, but we need to also pay attention to where the water goes.
Yeah, that's great perspective. So maybe a perfect lead into the next question as well. So we've talked a lot today about incentive, a lot about the carrot. I'm curious about the stick and what role, beyond what Carrie already noted, regulations sort of play in this big picture. If any of the other panelists have thoughts about that.
So I just want to point out that I wasn't talking about, you know, regulating in a negative way. I feel like there can be policy in both a positive way as well, and that is thinking about, you know, how our taxes are set up, how our policies are set up to make action happen rather than to prevent it. And there's a lot of different things that can happen. Think about the, I call it FACA, Food and Ag Climate Alliance. They're doing some great things in policy, the conversations on the Hill about climate action, and that's a way to, you know, leverage action that happen, not prevent people from doing things. Yeah.
And I'll just say, it's, in terms of carbon, it's free to pollute. It's free to pollute, and that has to change. And TMDLs are a great thing, and they've been around a long time, and at least they create some structure for which nutrients can be managed, and then someone can be rewarded for managing them positively. We need that in the carbon space as well. And, you know, I'm not sure if the government's ready for that, if the government can do it, but I think policy could certainly drive that. But in the interim, it's voluntary, and big food companies are getting on board, which is exciting. But the small ones, they're probably not, unless they're niche companies that are selling to specific consumers. So for it to be, you know, equal, equitable, all those things, we're going to need some policy activity to advance the entire food industry and bring farmers along. And I'm not saying regulate farmers. We got to regulate what's in those products.
I would even offer for us to not underestimate the power of the marketplace that's currently in existence today. You know, if we look at the way that farming has continued to evolve, even just over the past 100 years, we look at going from a much smaller scale farming operation to much larger economies of scale. And it's not your basic, it's not your mediocre farmers that are still playing the game today. These are gentlemen that are, and ladies out there that are business makers, they're business decision makers and leaders. So as they continue to get better and better at what they do, I think making sure they have the support mechanisms in place for them to continue to improve is crucial. And one of the things that I'll point to is the nutrient use efficiency numbers from a world standing all the way down to advanced practice implementers in the US. You know, when you get to the point that you're mining nutrients out of the soil on a yearly basis from a crop consumption perspective, it's hard to get a whole lot better than that and still be producing the levels of crops needed and desired and required by the general public. So I would just say, while I do think incentives and regulatory incentives and tax incentives are something that can certainly be looked at, I would be very careful to underestimate the power of the current marketplace before implementing regulations.
All right, we've got about 2 minutes left. We'll take one more question. And I like this question. So the question is, how do we ensure that the right message is getting to the youth and to the public about agriculture practices, when considering the fact that everyone wants the best looking food at a cheap price, but simultaneously wants farmers to bear the cost of protecting the environment? Any thoughts?
I'll start on that. I do a lot of youth educational forums and work with a lot of programs like that. And I think generally just talking about the messaging, because there is a disconnect, especially in urban centers, of how food is produced, where it comes from, the process to get it to your plate, and whether it's food production or energy production or, you know, building houses in an urban setting. Everything that we do in society has an impact, and people just need to understand what that impact is. So I think making sure the right message is just having these types of forums, the opportunity to be able to bring people together and to be able to talk about those and to be able to just communicate. Because at the end of the day, whether the public wants to hear it or not, we have the food system that we're all willing to pay for. And so I think, you know, to Jeff's point, whether, you know, everything has to be sustainable, which means food companies, growers, everybody has to be able to make it a business, or it can't function properly. But we all want what's best. And so maybe that's, you know, I don't know what that looks like, but I certainly think that, yeah, education, outreach, starting in schools and being able to understand, you know, the realities of the food system, I think is a good starting place. So certainly education.
I think that's a great place to wrap. In the interest of time, I'm going to thank the panelists, Carrie, Peyton, Michael, Jeff. thank you for being with us today and offering your perspectives. Thanks to the audience for joining us today. And we wish you all the best.